Arrhenius did a similar study. But these countries carefully hid these studies from the world for the simple reason that they were industrializing their countries in order to make the lives of their people better. 100 years after, we are being told, after these countries have moved away from reliance on industrial production for their economies to knowledge creation and artificial intelligence, and we are on the verge of industrialization, that it is dangerous to use the same energy that helped them to industrialize for us to do the same thing. We are told that we should rely on renewable energies. Ladies and gentlemen, to this minute, there isn't any guarantee, despite the resources being put into research on renewable energies, that it will meet the expectations that we've all been made to look to. So, what do we do? Go this way, or critically look into other parts of dealing with the climate challenge? We think, or I believe, that in the last 150 years, 2,500 megatons of emissions have been put in the atmosphere, primarily by today's industrialized countries. We are being told that because of the mess they have created, we cannot use energy, or we should use some form of energy that is not going to create additional mess. We have no problem with that. The question we want to ask, is that the only path to saving the planet? And we say no, because there are technologies today that will allow us to be able to extract the emissions, legacy emissions, that have been put up there in the last so many years. These countries are not developing and deploying these technologies for the simple reason that if they develop it and deploy it, then the so-called climate catastrophe that we are all afraid of, that fear will not be there anymore. And countries like in Africa that need abundant oil and gas resources to be able to industrialize, and they have it. We have 125 billion barrels proven reserves, over 600 trillion cubic feet of gas on the African continent. We can use it to also get industrialized. The fact is, nobody can guarantee you today, despite all the noise, that renewable energies will be able to provide the volume, the baseload energy that any of our countries need to be able to get industrialized. And we can't continue to be importers of everything we need. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, we did say that we certainly want the panelists to say exactly what they feel, and you've both of you, in fact, have done just that, which is just great. Which leads us on to the third of the panelists, and hopefully more of the same from Mr. Akol Ayi, the group chairman of the Trinity Group, South Sudan. Right, you've got 3 minutes.
Thank you, Ashraf. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to recognize our 2 ministers for my country, Minister of Wildlife and Conservation and Tourism, and Minister of Commerce and our ambassador, and my fellow countrymen and women that have come here. Thank you, ITF, for this opportunity to be here today. I think I'll be a little bit odd. I think my country, where I come from, and as we dive into this energy transition, we have to recognize that we must strike between this balance, between the just transition that we are talking about and the need of our people. And the country where I come from, we sit on a lot of reserve of crude oil. And I look at this as a catalyst that can be used as the mean to unlock the common man life improvement, as well as the provision of that energy that we require. If we go by the African Development Studies, that put it at 640 million Africans need access to energy and electricity. For me, my view of how we can have access to this energy and electricity is to have a mix of all. We have to invest in thermal and also the solar energy. This is only feasible in this era that we are in. If we talk of the carbon emission, I believe our continent has contributed at least 3% of that, which is insignificant. And if we put that aside and focus on what the global world order talks of, we'll be missing the point. And if we also have to contribute as a matter of fact of trying to reduce our carbon emission, Africa has lots to contribute, be it the vast landmass that we have that can put us, and I think the study of Deloitte that has said in 2050, there are 4 continents that will have ability to contribute to world hydrocarbon, which put North Africa to be the leading one, and followed by, I think, by North America and Australia and Middle East. Again, Africa is ranked at the leading in terms of this forefront. So I'm really thrilled to really look at how we can be able to position ourselves as a continent. Not only do we be the continent that will have to be looked at in the next 2 decades to come as a player that can be, instead of us exporting raw material, we should then add value addition and then sit on the cross table to offer services that can be provided from the comfort of being properly value added by our own people for the common good of our people, and also contribute to the overall orders at the table discussion. Thank you.
There we are. Thank you very much, Mr. Ayi from South Sudan. Let's move on to the 4th of the panelists, seated right next to me, Ms. Helen Broom, who is the Director for Projects and Asset-Based Finance at Afrexim Bank. Right, you've heard lots of things. I'm sure you have strong opinions. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think the conversation of an energy transition is very interesting. And it's interesting when put in the context of the fact that 600 million Africans don't have access to electricity, and 900 million Africans also do not have access to clean energy sources for cooking. That being said, we believe in the concept of a just energy transition, and this takes into consideration the fact that, number one, Africa only contributes 3% of the global emission, but at the same time, Africa is disproportionately affected by the impact of climate change. So we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we did not take center stage in the conversations around what constitutes a just energy transition. And for us, a just energy transition recognizes the fact that different African countries are at different phases in the path towards industrialization. And I believe it's a known fact that you cannot industrialize using renewable. It's never been done, and I'm not sure how Africa can achieve that. So it's important to recognize the importance of the use of our natural resources. Africa is home to 7% of the world gas reserves. Exporting our natural resources actually accounts for 70% of our GDP. So we will be doing ourselves a great disservice if we do not continue to exploit those natural resources and use that in the pursuit of our industrialization. But we should also recognize the key role that Africa has to play in this whole conversation, especially given the fact that 60% of the resources needed to decarbonize is going to come from the African continent. I mean, the DRC is home to the world's largest reserve of copper. For those who don't know, copper is a critical ingredient used in the manufacturing of lithium batteries, which is a critical component of the electrical vehicles. But how can Africa win in this conversation? And I think there are three things that we need to concentrate on. Number one is improving our role in value creation, and I'm going to use the term beneficiation. Why is it now that we export our mineral resources in its raw state or form, and the value is created outside the continent, and the finished product is re-imported using our limited foreign exchange? We buy back the finished goods, and it doesn't account for our GDP. We lose 90% of value by selling those minerals in the raw state. So in that, following that line of thought, we need to focus on improving our local manufacturing capacity. And that's where the AFCFTA is going to play a very key role. The AFCFTA, if implemented correctly, can unlock $500 billion worth of incremental revenues. It's expected to lift an additional 18 million Africans out of poverty. So that's the conversation we need to be having. That's the narrative we need to be pushing. The third thing we need to be looking at is how do we develop our local workforce? I mean, Africa is home to the youngest population on the planet. The average age is 18 years old. That is a vibrant workforce that can be deployed. But the question is, how do we skill them? How do we skill them with the necessary tools and resources that makes them relevant for the future that we're aspiring to? So those are the three key messages I would like to leave. And when we're sitting at this table, having a conversation on energy transition, which we deserve a right to be seated in front of the table, we should be pushing that narrative and trying to make it work for the African continent. Thank you.
There we are. Thank you. Thanks for that, Helen. Right, just a couple of things before we move on. I did mention that I certainly love you to be part of the conversation. Now, whereas we can't take questions from the audience, what you can do and engage with us is through social media. So do use that hashtag IATF2023, and then obviously tag IATF, but also you can tag every one of us on all the relevant social media platforms. I will certainly follow you on that, and use that to give comment, use that to ask questions, agree, don't agree, use that. Because I think we want to follow that conversation well beyond this particular platform today. But of course, for the panel, you can agree and disagree right away. And therefore, I'm going to give you the opportunity. I mean, all four of you have heard each other. And I'll start with you, Helen. Is there anything that you've heard from your colleagues here, and you're like, I want to pick up on that issue? And often we leave it behind and it never happens. So I'm going to ask all of you that, but I'm going to start with you. Anything that your colleagues have said here up front, just say, I want to pick up on that. What is that?
Well, I think this is a good segue into a conversation on how we can see more collaboration across not just the African continent, but also the African institutions that represent the continent when some of these conversations is taking place, and help push the narrative. At Afrexim Bank, we are trying to be at the fore of such conversations, and even internally, we have developed products that can help position the African continent along some of those three lines I gave in my opening remarks. We have established a vibrant EPC program, and it's a program which helps to retain some of the knowledge base on the continent, because we realize that when a lot of these contracts are given to foreign EPC contractors, the values is not retained on the continent. So how can we support local EPC contractors to go out and effectively bid for some of these jobs? So we're doing that by facilitation. We're also taking it a step further by providing them with the supporting instruments needed to actively bid for this position. We've also set up a project preparation facility, because another thing that we recognize is the unsuitability or the lack of bankable projects. And not because those projects do not exist, but because there's a lot of preparatory work that needs to take those projects from the conception stage to a stage where you can actually approach financial institutions for financing. And what is missing in that whole spectrum is the absence of the capital needed to get from a feasibility or concept stage to a bankability stage. So recognizing that absence, we created a project preparation facility which helps project developers. It's $2 million. It's not a grant, it's a loan. And the idea is that the money is repaid when you do attain financial close. But I think the conversation should be more along collaboration, and I recognize one of my speakers here, APPO. Afrexim Bank, working with APPO, is going to be setting up an African energy bank. And the whole idea is to take, we recognize the fact that there's a lot of capital flights that's leaving the continent, and this is obviously along the lines of the conversation of, reducing emissions, push towards cleaner energy, leave your resources in the ground. But we recognize that we still need to bring those resources out of the ground because we need the revenues to industrialize. So where Africa is missing in a lack of capital and lack of access to financing to actually develop these natural resources, Afrexim Bank is trying to step in and fill up that gap. And hopefully, in doing that, we will try and crowd in additional capital to support the continent.
And I think many of you will be very happy to hear that, sort of coming and knocking on your door, because, well, you're right, it's just critically important, right? I'm going to leave it, and I'll leave it open to any one of you here. The same I put to Helen. Anything else any one of you wish to pick up on what your colleagues have said that you'd like to raise, based upon what they've said? Anybody? Just raise your hands. Go ahead.
No, I think since we are sitting in an Afrexim Bank organized program, it's really important to recognize, especially what the bank has done in the continent, especially under the stewardship of His Excellency Prophet Orama. I'm one of the living testimony of what the bank has been able to do. If we talk even of the energy, especially investing in solar energy, it's very expensive. But then using PPP model, which I think President Orama and Prime Minister Mia, I always pronounce her name wrongly, they've really headed this. And for us to invest in the energy transition, the Continental Bank or Developmental Bank need to step in syndicating. And there is no better place than Afrexim Bank using the product that she mentioned. And most importantly, if we have to unlock the continent resource that we have and adding value before they are now exported as instead of raw mineral, the bank has to step in. And I will speak for the country the way I come from. We're indicted with a lot of resources. They can only make meaning if value has been added. We export crude now. It's no fossil fuel. We are not supposed to speak about it as per the topic is. But in reality, it's what we need most to unlock our true potential. Our true potential can come from the agriculture, mining. We have the largest number of animals in the world, more than the human being that we have in our country. All this can be unlocked if we have the adequate financing reasonably. If we talk of the energy as well, the developed countries have also to step in, using platforms like Afrexim Bank to provide the cheap financing that will enable us to really leapfrog some of this development that is required for us to reduce our carbon emission. But our interest in the continent is to provide access, because we have 640 million that need electricity and clean energy. And for me, this can be achieved by a mix of all those. And really, I would like to thank Afrexim Bank for spearheading this, because what we lack is the capital. We have the raw material. Call it from what we have, the lithium and cobalt and the like. They are all in Congo. We are in Congo Belt. Everything that is in Congo is South Sudan. What we need is capital to unlock that for the common good of everyone. So thank you, the bank, for all this noble job. And we are here to be the foot soldiers to unlock that for the common good for all of us in the continent. Thank you.
Yeah, point made. I think, that point is important, bringing up that there's a highly industrialized Africa, and there's an Africa that is not industrialized. And the fact is, their priorities are not the same. And therefore, somebody has to make those calls in terms of what then is the priorities. Just before we're going to move on to other things, you may want to pick up any issues that has been said before. Any one of you?
I think on my end, it's that conversation about what does Africa need to win. There's so many elephants in the room, and I find us focused on theoretical frameworks that work in a perfect world. We talk about collaboration, and as we speak today, we haven't dealt with the issue of intra-Africa travel for tourism, not even business, right? We have an ecosystem that really penalizes excellence. And these are some of the fundamental things. To challenge the current tide that's against us, we have to look within. I think a lot of these ideas are certainly great and they will move us forward. But the most critical component for me is, how do you build an Africa that understands that everything it needs is within itself, starting from our government and the policies. The AXFA is before us today. If as governments we can come together and throw our weight behind it, we would accelerate it to a point where Africa, speaking with one voice, becomes a powerful bloc to be reckoned with across the world. The only reason today we are speaking about a just transition is because as Africans we're aligned on the suffering of our people, and we would not sacrifice that for some energy or climate issue. It's a heads or heads toss. We do, we die; we don't, we die. So fundamentally, I think a lot of the winning happens when we focus on the core things that we need to do. One, our governments need to get serious. Collaboration between regions, establishing the policies internally, country-wise and externally, to drive not just trade, but the development of our industry. And I'm speaking about our industries that exist today, not even the transition industries, and create the wealth we need to then embark on that transition. And the last point is just to pick up on the gentleman's comment about selling crude as a country. There's nothing to be shy about that. I think the world today is largely configured to consume crude and gas. That evolution will come, but again, I think there is that urgency to get our commodities out of the ground, ensure that we can translate it to currency to then embark on that transition, which then puts us where the rest of the world wants us to be, as a clean development pursuer of progress. So those would be my comments just on those 2 points.
Would you like to just add to that, Dr. Omar Farouk Ibrahim?
Thank you very much. I'll rather take on the president of Afri-Exim, former president of Afri-Exim. I think the era of lamentations should be gone. Yeah. Colonialism has come. We admit there has been problems, structural problems, but 60, 70 years after independence, if we continue to say colonialism, then we will never get out of the mess we found ourselves in. I think we have to accept that the destiny of Africa is in the hands of Africans. And the earlier we began to look inwards, like my colleague here said, for the solutions to the challenges confronting us on our continent, the better. I take an example. I did say in my opening remarks that 2,500 megatons of emissions have been put in the atmosphere in the last 150 years. I also said that there are today technologies for carbon dioxide removal. All we should be asking, in my opinion, is that the countries that created this mess and have the capacity through technology to further develop these technologies and deploy them to remove these emissions, should remove only 20%, which is 500 megatons. When they remove 500 megatons, it will give us in Africa the opportunity to use the same fuel energies that they use to industrialize. We will use it to get industrialized in the next 50, 75 years. And what we will emit will not be up to the 500 megatons that they have removed. But nobody is talking about that. African leaders will rather go and ask for just energy transition, and the world will tell them, okay, we'll give you a climate fund, mitigation, adaptation, and since since Sharm el-Sheikh, we now have this thing about, no, not institution, loss and damage. For God's sake, these monies are not going to materialize. Why are we deceiving ourselves? If these guys are going to use that money, take your money, further develop these technologies, deploy them, and give us the opportunity to also use the same energy that helped you to get to where you are today, so that we can also develop. But we have this mentality that, no, let's ask them, out of 100 billion, if we get 100 million or 50 million, it will be good for our country. For how long are we going to continue to be begging? I think it's a very, very wrong strategy. And in this respect, let me say it, in Apple, we don't believe in just theorizing. We conducted a study 2 years ago on the future of the oil and gas industry in Africa in the light of the energy transition. And we identified 3 main challenges. The first is funding, because for the 75 years that Africa has been producing oil and gas, we have been heavily dependent, almost exclusively dependent, on foreign financing, IOCs, international service companies, international financial institutions. Now that these funding agencies have decided to move away from us, and with all the resources that we have, we are unable to fund our oil and gas projects. The second challenge is technology and expertise. Again, there isn't today on the African continent what you really say is a world-class research, development, and innovation institution for oil and gas. All of these are outside of the African continent. Yet, we produce 7 million barrels a day. We have over 600 trillion cubic feet of gas, over 125 billion barrels of oil. At the same time, of all the continents in the world, Africa has the largest proportion of its people living in energy poverty. Let me recognize Professor Orama really for your support, for your vision for Africa, because on the financial challenge, currently we are working with the Afri-Exim Bank to establish what my sister here mentioned, the Africa Energy Bank.
Okay. Can I just put there? There's so much that comes up around those issues. You know, you use the word a lot of times like us and them and we and they, and I mean, we can have a 1 hour, 2 hour conversation on that alone, right? Which I think is fascinating. But Helen Pruma, if I can bring you in here in terms of your role as a bank that's positioned around, you know, import and export. So you're very much at the threshold of the funding issue that you spoke about, right? But here's the thought. when your bank advises development, right? We've already made the point that Africa is, compared to others, de-industrialized, and yet is being asked to make the changes around just transition as the same as the others. And then you have an example about the war in the Ukraine, and the Europeans very, very quickly backtrack on what they're asking Africa to do. So in terms of enabling projects, right, how much of a moral issue comes into that in terms of, we must understand big picture, small picture, and how does it play out?
I think it's important to understand that the whole concept of decarbonization cannot be achieved with commercial debt. And we say that recognizing the fact that, pick a number, half of African countries are experiencing some level of debt distress. And that's obviously with everything that's going on in the global economy. But even just shaping the narrative and the conversation, Africa is home to the world's largest carbon sink reserves, right? Between the DRC, Congo, and Liberia and Sierra Leone. So Africa is actually critical in the global efforts at decarbonization because those global sink reserves will act as a net absorber of emissions. That is a resource, that is a tool that should feature very prominently in the conversations that we're having. The conversation should not be about borrowing money at unsustainable interest rates from the foreign world to decarbonize. We at Afreximbank have even undertaken a study on decarbonization, and we're still reviewing the preliminary results, but what is very apparent is that if we embark on a decarbonization path and ignore all of the other salient points that I've talked about, the role the AFCFTA is going to play, how we're going to leverage our natural resources, it will result in a negative GDP for the entire continent.
That's so important.
So it's very apparent that while we cannot be left out in the decarbonization conversation because, again, Africa is disproportionately affected by the effect of emissions, we should be negotiating from a position of strength. And we should be saying, we have these resources, we can actually aid the global economy in decarbonization. How are we going to deploy these resources? How are we going to get compensated for those resources? And I like the fact that, we're going to COP28 in a couple of weeks. The concept of loss and damages is featuring very frequently, and our African leaders are going to be pushing that narrative at COP28. Because like my colleague says, we didn't cause the situation that we're in now, even though we're affected. We cannot be made to pay the penalties, especially when we're still far behind in our industrialization efforts.
I think it's a very important point that needs to be amplified. We've got about 10 minutes to go, incredibly. Time just goes, right? I want to bring in Dr. Anoja Arun once again. So the point has been brought up already. It gets me to ask this question. You see, we can discuss the technicalities of the just transition for 2-3 hours. It doesn't really matter here. We all know there needs to be a move. We also know that we have other challenges. But here's the big issue. How big, how powerful, how impactful is the African voice? At forums like this, at other forums, there's a COP coming up again soon, whether it's the United Nations, on these type of issues, just how big is the African voice? And perhaps as you answer that, if the answer is not big enough, and you can answer that, then how then do we assert ourselves so that our voices can be heard and acted upon?
Thanks for that. That's a very great question. I think when you look at, I have this joke, I say with my friends that we were colonized because the settlers realized that where they had settled was not as vibrant and as prosperous as where we were, which was why they came over. But the reality is, Africa is the transition. You don't transition without Africa. I'm speaking about the entire world. We don't transition without Africa. That is the size of our voice. The question is, potential has never gotten anybody anywhere. We have to act. And in action, I want to again come to the president of the Afro-Exim Bank, Professor Rama, who looks at the world, zooms into Africa, and when the bank engages on anything in Africa, the notion is not solely about bankability. Is this good for us? It may not be profitable in the near term. It may need development infrastructure. It may need people. You heard of the phrase, build it and they will come. And taking that approach to the continent means that you develop capacity that is required. And on the back of that capacity, you industrialize and you build the rest of what you require. Now, unfortunately, you can't do that in a hurry. So we need very more Afro-Exim banks to be alive and to sustain and to continue to support. But when we speak about the voice of Africa, there is that collaboration, there is the understanding of what we own as part of this journey, but more importantly, there is the element that my chairman has spoken about, which is do not go to the table to get dictated to. There isn't one path to this transition. There are several paths, and one of them involves investing your developed finance and wealthy economies, technology, to extract what you put in the atmosphere. And
I'm just looking forward to us being so much more assertive, isn't it? We probably need to do that as a continent, right? Which I want to get the South Sudan perspective as well. But just before I do that, I think it's clear we know the problems the continent has got. We also know that two things, that amongst the most innovative people in the world comes from this continent. I mean, that is an enormous leverage if we want to use it. And the other is we know we are also the youngest continent. And in terms of moving ahead, that is a huge advantage that we need to understand. And probably in the 7 or 8 minutes to go that I want to just throw that to all of you about how we use that leverage, right? But just starting from a South Sudan point of view, I mean, understanding what are I'm looking at what are the advantages Africa has that in spite of the concerns around a just transition and the need to industrialize and to brighten up, there could also be huge financial opportunities, lucrative opportunities, and this is a marketplace for Africa, not just to do what is just, but at the same time to score big time. I mean, do you see that as well?
Yeah, I think we have great opportunities in the continent, as you said, starting with the rare minerals that are sitting in DRC, and which are a critical component in some of these technologies that will be required in the next decades to come. And I think that's where our leverage starts from. And to my colleague on the panel, we must believe in ourselves. And I think that belief will be also another strong leverage that we can also exercise as we go into the next decade. Make no mistake, in the next 10, 20 years to come, the continent is going to be the biggest employer in this globe. And I think that's also our leverage. From my country, South Sudan, we have the youngest population, put 72% are below 30 years. And if we really, and this is what the continent through Afro-Exim Bank is doing, because everything revolves around financing. And if we can get it right with Afro-Exim Bank, and which is what they are doing now today with the help of IFTF and the AU and the like, and should be supported by our governments in the continent as well, then we have all the minerals that are required in this world. And when we sit back and start adding value, into those minerals, we don't need to really be taken for a ride because we can develop for our own use using intra-Africa trade. I was a couple of years ago in South Africa before I think they joined Afreximbank. And they go send their potatoes to Europe. And because there is no convergence, and with intra-Africa trade, you can facilitate trade. And this is where now the certification that Afreximbank is doing. Because there's that trust between ourselves that used not to be there before. But with the convergence in the bank and where we are sitting today, people will come here to trade with us in this marketplace, which is also being developed. So I think from my country, as I mentioned earlier, we sit on a lot of reserve. We are the third producer of Sub-Saharan Africa. We need that oil to unlock our true potential, be it our neighbors in Egypt, Ethiopia, which consume almost 105,000 barrels per day, and they import everything. But in the next door, we produce. So if we add value on that and send to them, we'll foster agriculture, which is what we did now because we were dependent on Ukraine on food. Sudan or South Sudan, we used to be the leading producer of rice in Africa, which is that Sudan is in a place called Awil, in one of our states. If we now post and invest in agriculture, we don't need to import food. We would instead export the surplus that we need.
So
Thank you.
how do we get to a situation where, I mean, we're here at this marketplace, there's high degrees of multilateralism, there's the African Union, we know all of that. We talk about collaboration. I mean, every one of us talks about it. Not just on this platform. When we go out, we're going to talk about the same thing. Who wants to answer this? How do we get to a situation where, when we talk about imposing a just transition, how does the countries that make up Africa, above 50 countries, how do we impose collaboration for the greater good? I mean, who wants to? And I use the key word is not collaboration, but impose collaboration within the nations of Africa. Who wants to raise that? Yeah?
I'm sorry.
Okay. All right, go first. We'll get to Helen in a sec. Yeah.
If I understand the question properly, is imposing the just transition on?
Well, impose collaboration. I mean,
Right.
just transition is one, but the point of collaboration as a continent.
I think it's an idea that would benefit the continent. I think what we need to take into cognizance is the varied development paths of the countries on the continent. Imposing in a collective rarely works. You would need a body that really at least is seen as a beacon of light for the continent. And I think right now we still have some inherent challenges that will make that quite difficult. But if it were possible, would it accelerate development? Certainly. I mean, we're seeing situations where countries that are sitting next to each other are pretty much expending the same amount of capital on pre-feasibility studies for the same just transition ambition. We're looking at wind at the moment. Two countries next to us have done work there, but we're all doing that work individually. So even from a cost perspective, you'll find that collaboration, whether at regional or across the continent, you would definitely leapfrog, in my view, this transition conversation. But you would need to get over that collaboration.
Well, therein lies the challenge.
Conversation
Yeah.
first.
You want to add to that very quickly?
May I?
Wrap up? Yeah.
Please.
All right. Well,
Let-
can I come to you in just a second? You can go first, Helen. Sorry. Just 1 sec. You can go ahead. Yeah.
I think when we look at the concept of collaboration, the first thing we need to focus on is breaking down self-imposed barriers to trading with each other. And I think this is, one of the things that the IATF seeks to accomplish. It costs more to transport goods from Nigeria to, say, Burkina Faso than it costs to bring those same goods from China. So you ask yourself, why is that the case? We're doing ourselves a great disservice. We set up all of this barriers to trading freely, and because those barriers are self-imposed, that value goes outside the continent. I spoke earlier of the fact that DRC is the home to the world's largest copper reserves. But there is literally no refining capacity on the continent. And the argument I would put forward is, even if that manufacturing capacity cannot be set up in DRC, why not South Africa, right? But then you'd ask yourself, the concept of moving goods from DRC to South Africa would probably be uneconomical, and it would probably make sense to move those goods to China and bring them back. And that's because we've set up all these internal barriers to trade. So one of the things that Afro-Exim Bank is doing is that we're setting up a special economic zone that straddles DRC and Zambia. And it's literally a battery minerals park. And this speaks to what I spoke about earlier on, about retaining some of this manufacturing capacity on the continent. And the idea is, if the whole world is going to decarbonize, and we recognize that Africa is home to 60% of the resources needed to decarbonize, then the conversation should be around how are you setting up local manufacturing capacity on the continent. And that, again, will aid us in the whole subject of industrialization. So this battery precursor park, which is what we call it, will help attract some of the global solar companies to come and set up. There's no reason why we cannot have electrical vehicles manufactured locally on the continent, why we cannot have batteries manufactured locally on the continent. The second topic is really
I'm going to push
around
you very quickly, yeah?
Yes, around the concept of, again, of mobility. And again, studies have shown that shipping is one of the largest contributors to emissions. So again, if ships have to leave the continent and come back, if we can cut out that movement, then we're already eradicating some of
We're almost going to wrap up.
emissions.
Dr. Ibrahim, if you could just answer that as well. I know you wanted to say something in about a minute, please. Did you want to add to that?
What was the question?
No, I thought in terms of what we were talking about, the issue of collaboration and imposing, did you want to add to that? If not, we'll move on.
I wanted to come back to the issue of just energy transition. I think when we go to discussions at the global fora, Africa doesn't seem at any time to prepare before it goes to these meetings. And most of the time, our issues are defined as financial or money matters. You ask for just energy transition, and it is defined as, okay, we'll give you more funds for loss, for damage, for mitigation, for adaptation, etc. Like I said, if we are talking about just energy transition, what I thought we were going to sit down to tell those who created this mess is that, please, as you force us to produce our NDCs and commitments, we are also asking you that in the next 50 years, commit to removing 50, or just 20% of what you have put in there so that we can also be able to get industrialized.
Absolutely.
For whatever reason, we don't do that. We are ready, waiting to be given some pittance, which don't even come. And when these countries give us this money, it's like they are doing us a big favor. But if you ask them to clean up their mess, they will know they are not doing you a favor.
Okay, that's where we're almost going to wrap up, like almost. I'm going to give each one of you a chance, but I'm going to test your restraining powers here. You got 30 seconds, each one of you, only 30 seconds, to land a thought, to deliver a thought that will land with this audience here. Hopefully something you haven't said before, right? Maybe like the unanswered question. Alan, you next to me, you can go ahead first. 30 seconds.
Okay. I think the parting words I'll just leave is Africa, again, we're home to the largest resources. We're home to the most vibrant working force of skilled and unskilled labor. And we need to harness those resources. We need to look inwards and see how those resources can be brought forward. In terms of pursuing a just energy transition, we believe in a dual pronged approach. We need to still bring out our natural resources because we need those revenues to pursue our industrialization. At the same time, we recognize that we need to also be part of the conversation around decarbonization, but also recognizing that we would do it at a slower pace because our focus really now is to industrialize the
I
continent.
think it's a very, very good point. Thank you for that. Right, your 30 seconds starts now.
Okay, I think in the continent we need to use all the untapped resource that we have to create an impact to the common man of our continent, and also foster this just transition in the comfort of our zone, creating opportunities, employment, removing us from poverty, and also creating wealth using the available resource. Thank you.
Well, there we are. Thank you. Right, Chair. Let's get to the third of the four panelists. 30 seconds.
To us on the African continent, the challenges of energy transition are essentially existential challenges. It's a matter of life and death for hundreds of millions of Africans who do not have access to electricity at all. To the developed world, the challenges are just a matter of comfort. It is whether they have air conditioner 24 hours or not. It's just a matter of comfort to them. To us, it's a matter of life and death. And for that reason, we must use whatever available energy source we have to be able to also move our people out of the poverty that they are in now.
Okay, got that. And the last voice, Dr. Irun.
Thank you. I'll use my first 10 seconds to recognize our former president, Your Excellency. It's a pleasure to always have you here, Olusegun Obasanjo. He's always present at the conversations that matter and has never stopped lending his voice to a just Africa, not just a just transition.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just remain seated for a second. I want to thank you from the platform here.
You guys said everything. There was no repeating.
Don't forget about that hashtag IATF 2023 so we can get your thoughts as well. I think it's really important. But I want to thank the four of you, every one of you. Dr. Anoji Irun, thank you for your time. Dr. Umar Farouk Ibrahim, thank you for your time. Mr. Akol Ayi, appreciate your input as well. And Ms. Helen Broom, thank you for your time. Absolutely. Give them some applause, please do. And as they get up, I want to do this. You know, when we say applause, we tend to just do that. I want to see if each one of you can clap for a full minute non-stop when I tell you, because that gives you a sense of the type of energy we can create in this auditorium and on the African continent. Are you happy to go with that when I tell you? 1 minute non-stop. Let's go. Big noise. Yay! You see the bottom line of all of this, and I speak often about this. We say champion people, champion nation. If we need to build our energy capacity, it starts with the people, and you've just displayed that. Therein lies the challenge. Thank you so much. Thank you.